Okay, that is going on. Of course, they want to give us to eat a part. Of course, so go on. What can we do? Nothing. Of course, they are gonna tear us apart. They want to give us to eat a part. Of course, then what can we do? Just resist. Of course, that is what you can have. So go on and let's do that. Of course, that is what you can have. That no one can against us. Of course, you want everything. You want the sources. Of course, the sources have to stay in the country to develop the country. Of course, that is what you can have if you want to rob the sources. Of course, then let's go. What can you do against you? Just nothing. Of course, that is what you can have. But they believe in democratic communism. Of course, that is what you can have. So go on. Of course, that is what you can see. That you want to keep the sources and give it to the great enterprises from the West. Of course, that is what you can have. That you have great enterprises of the West with the whole money, of course, with the whole sources and developing the sources, of course, and increasing them, save their money, of course, that's what you can have. And in the country there's nothing, and they only give us to eat apart, of course, what can we do against that? Just nothing, of course, that is what you can have. We can do nothing, that is what you can see. So go on, of course, that is what you can see, that you can come and of course, starting, that is what you can have, that no one can against me. So come on, of course, starting, come to my BMV, of course, starting, that is what you can have. BMW or however you want to say BMV, of course, starting, that is what you can have. Come and go on, that is what you can have, of course, starting, you know I'm crazy rich, of course, starting, that is what you can have. But I'm crazy rich, of course, starting, that is what you can have, that no one can against me. So come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have. But I earned my whole money, that is what you can have. That I earned it, of course, darling, that is what you can see, that no one can against me. So come on. Of course, darling, you know I'm your devil, so come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me. Of course, darling, you know I'm your devil, so come on and let's go. Of course, darling, I'm in BMW. Of course, darling, I'm in BMV. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I'm your devil, so go on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against us, and they can ring, but we are not gonna take the cards. Of course, they are not gonna reach our phone. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. So come on, that I'm crazy rich and I'm not gonna pay a single cent to no one. That is what you can have. So come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me. So come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that the sources have to stay in the country to develop the country. Of course, with the sources in the country, you can sell the sources at a fair price and make school and hospital and houses for everyone. Of course, darling, but they want to rob the sources for the rich enterprises from the West. Of course, that is what you can have for the millionaires and for the to the rich people from the West. Of course, they want to steal the money. Of course, darling. Okay, then let's start. That is what you can have, that no one can against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me. Of course, darling, the sources should stay in the country to develop the country, to sell the sources at a fair price and make schools and hospitals and good houses for everyone in the country with the sources and then, of course, darling, that is what you can have, but they want to rob them for the rich people from the West. Of course, darling, then let's them, that is what you can have, what can you do against them? Just nothing. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, so let's go. Of course, darling, that is what you can see. that no one can against me. Of course, darling, they want to give us to eat that part. Of course, darling, okay, then let's go. Of course, darling, that is what chicken have to. They want to rob the sources for the two rich people from the west. Of course, darling, then let's let them. Of course, darling, what can we do against that? Just nothing. Of course, darling, that is what you can see. The deserts, we should stay in the country to clean up the country and make schools, hospitals, and good houses for everyone. Of course, darling, but we want to spoil the sword system. What can you do against that? Just nothing. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. I'm crazy rich, of course, darling, and with my BMV, with my rich pigeon, your devil, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me. Of course, darling, you know I'm your devil, so come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that no one can against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against us, so come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that I'm crazy rich and I'm gonna stay. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I'm in a hangover, but I have a back full of gold. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I'm in a hangover, but I have a bag full of gold. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, so come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I'm crazy rich. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I'm here, the crazy bitch. Of course, I'm crazy rich. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that no one can against me, so come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that you're gonna survive. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have here, that no one can against me, so come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that no one can against me, so come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on. Of course, darling, I'm your devil in a BMV. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me. Of course, darling, that I'm not gonna take the phone. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that they give it down, that I'm gonna hang over and I'm not gonna take the phone. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, so come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I wanted the sources stay in the country. Of course, darling, that we love the country with the sources and make schools and hospitals and good houses for everyone. Of course, darling, and they come with FMI making loans. Of course, darling, that the people cannot pay back with the taxes because the loans are too expensive. Of course, darling, and then the presidents have to make what FMI tells to them because they couldn't pay back because the loans are too expensive and they are not developing the country. They are making gifts to the rich people that the population pay back with the taxes. Of course, darling, and things like those never mind. Of course, darling, that is what you can say, that they want state-owned companies and market intervention. Of course, state-owned companies to have a strong state with decision-making capacity and solvents. And of course, darling, and market intervention so the enterprises don't mistreat the workers and sell things expensive for cheap. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, basic economics. Of course, that is what you can have, that they want market intervention, state-owned companies. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. Democratic communism would be perfect, but it couldn't be. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. So go on, of course, darling, and your devil in BMV. Of course, darling. Of course, darling, but that's what she can have that they are robbing the sources for the rich people from the west. Of course, darling, then let's go. Of course, darling, you know I'm crazy rich. Of course, darling, that is what she can have that I'm crazy rich. I'm on the beach. Of course, darling, that is what she can have that no one can against me. So come on, of course, darling, that is what she can see. That no one can against me, so come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I'm crazy rich and like that I'm gonna stay, of course, darling, that is what you can have, so go on, of course, darling, I'm your devil, I'm gonna be on and I'm gonna hang off and I'm not gonna take the phone, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, of course, darling, I'm your devil, and I'm BNB, and I'm not gonna take the phone because I wanna hang out and I'm not gonna take the phone. And of course, darling, so right, of course, darling, that is what she can have. Of course, darling, those are the bases for the future. For the future conflicts, of course, darling, so let's go and write your movie, of course, darling, with which pigeon here I did. So come on, of course, darling.